Okay, let's get started. Let's open our Bibles up to the book of Isaiah and chapter 28. I'm getting everything ready here. Isaiah chapter 28. All right, and they made a covenant with death. Okay, what a wonderful passage. Sounds like a great deal, doesn't it? When you first hear about that, they made a covenant with death. It doesn't, your first thing is you think they're making an agreement to die. That's immediately when I think of that, they think, well, they were suicidal, and it means actually the opposite of that. But let's go to verse 14, Isaiah chapter 28, verse 14. What we're going to talk about is this. This is what we're going to talk about. The whole point of the message is there's a contrast between those that made a covenant with death and God's response, which is the coming of the Messiah. And so those two things are in contrast. You're going to see those play out in this passage. And at the end, we're going to look at kind of an unexpected twist, and that is the significance of this passage in modern theology in the terms of tongues and speaking in tongues and signs and wonders and those sorts of things. And I think if you look out there, I think it'll shock you as you look at this. Anyway, let's go to verse 14. We'll read Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 14. Wherefore, hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men, that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell we're in agreement. Now, who in the world could be in agreement with hell? But you're gonna find what that means in just a moment. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come to us. That's what they said. Okay? We have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, and a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. Judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. The hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies. The waters shall overflow the hiding place. And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it. Okay, not exactly uplifting message, but nevertheless an important message. Why? Because it's the word of the Lord, and that's what God said to the people. Now let's put this in a little bit of historical context, and then we'll go into the passage. This was a time right before the nation of Israel, or Ephraim, which is a euphemism for the northern kingdom. This is right before they're going to go into captivity. This is preparing the people that they're going to be taken into captivity, and God had reached the end. He was going to bring judgment upon them. Now, I want to make sure that you understand, I'm not saying that that's what's happening today in a global sense, like it happened then. But what's interesting is that the principles are always the same. The principles are always the same. They don't change. And where we may not be looking at a nation or a world that's falling into judgment as though they were, the principles that existed then exist now in the hearts and lives of people, individuals. In other words, this was written for that time, but we're going to make an application from that in our time. That's why God included it in the Bible. A lot of times people don't understand that, and they'll take something like this and say, this is what's happening right now. Maybe, but maybe not, right? It may just be another one of the pandemics that happened like in 1918. You got to be careful. You don't want to say this is the end of the world, because you could have said the same thing in 1918, right? And obviously that wasn't the end of the world. And this too shall pass. There's nothing new under the sun. And so as we look at this and we go into this passage, verse 14, wherefore, and we're going to come back to this idea of wherefore. We're going to come down at the very end. I'm going to reference this again. Because wherefore, when you see it in the Bible, you have to ask what it's there for. You see a wherefore, what is it there for? And this refers back to the first part of chapter 28, where, I'll just go ahead and introduce it now, where the prophet and the priest were drunken, where God said, how can I speak to this people? They've all gone away from me. Nobody will hear. Nobody will listen. Wherefore he's going to bring into this nation a another group of people. And verse 11 says, with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak unto this people. And this is a passage that Paul references in the New Testament in teaching on tongues. And so one of the questions one might ask, and this is kind of getting as a little teaser for the end of the message, one of the questions somebody might ask is, when is the first time that tongues are used in the Bible or referenced in the Bible? Immediately people say, well, Acts chapter 2. But we're not in Acts. We're in Isaiah. The first time tongues were used was in the book of Genesis. That's when God judged the Tower of Babel and said that that they're going to create the judgment was that people are going to speak in a different language. It's where the origin of the language was for. And tongues are another language. That's what the word tongues mean. Even into the 1800s, the word tongues was used in such a way that you would say, and the people spoke in a strange tongue. Or we came over to South America and we went into the Amazon jungle and the natives spoke with a strange tongue. We would say language, but the word language and tongues are interchangeable. That's what they mean. In fact, even in Acts chapter 2, what do you see? You see the people speaking, but the people heard in their own native language. So the man speaks in, say, English, but then the Bimba hears him speak in Bimba. The Frenchman hears him speak in French. The Russian hears him speak in Russian, and so on and so forth. So we see that idea of languages. And now we see that God says, I'm going to come and judge this nation. I'm going to judge them with another people, with stammering lips and an unknown tongue. He will speak unto the people. To whom he said, this is the rest wherewith ye may cause the weary to rest. And this is a refreshing, yet they would not hear. This is a group of people that would not hear. It's interesting that when you look at tongues in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 2, there were two groups of people, weren't there? One group said, wow, this is the wonderful words of God. And the other one said, these men are drunk. They wouldn't hear. Right? So as we look into this in verse 14, that's what came before. So we don't want to necessarily go there. We want to look at verse 14. Scornful men. Okay, wherefore, hear the word of the Lord. Verse 14, ye scornful men. So he's writing to these scornful men. What does the word scornful mean? Well, it's in the book of Proverbs, we see the wise, we see the simple, we see the fool, and we see the scornful. We see these four groups of people, and God seems to have divided the world up in those. The wise is the one that seeks knowledge. The simple follows. You take a simple person, you put him by a wise person, he'll seek wisdom. You take a simple person and you sit him by a scornful, and he'll seek scornful. The scornful is the person that knows what's wrong, but does it anyway. The fool does wrong, but he doesn't know why he's doing it. Okay, and that's really a simple definition, but that divides those people up. So the scornful man knows they're doing wrong, right? But they do it anyway. They just say, I don't care, I'm going to do it. Another definition of scornful in this passage, when you look up the word, you study the etymology of the word that's used there, it means a bragger, a person that brags, a person that's like, I'm the greatest. So immediately what I think of is the, giant, massive poster on the side of the wall, major prophet, so-and-so. I'm thinking, well, that's kind of bragging. Miracles, deliverance, all these things that we see on these signs around here in Africa. What? So you're guaranteeing that you're going to see miracles. You're going to guarantee that you're going to have all of these supernatural things if you come. To me, that seems quite braggadocious. I mean, you come tomorrow at the mega meeting and we guarantee the Spirit of God will come because actually, you know what? He listens to what we tell him to do. And if we say he's going to be there, he will come. Because really, we're here and God is here. And I want you to, and I know that a lot of people maybe in Africa would take exception to that. They wouldn't like that. That wouldn't be palatable to them. But I want you to challenge you to just listen a little longer and look at this passage and see what God said. So that word scornful can mean braggadocious or scornful. But whether they're scorning and saying, I know what's wrong, but I don't care, or I am the greatest thing in the world, you need to come to me for answers, both indicate pride. The rulers of Jerusalem at this time were filled with pride, and pride is the opposite of humility. Matthew 5:3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Scornful men are the opposite of poor in spirit. Whether it's scornful meaning they are rejecting what is right, or whether it's scornful meaning they are braggadocious and they are thinking that, boy, they are the spiritual answer to the needs of man. Boy, that's a big problem right there. Verse 15 says, "Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death." Now that's an odd statement. I mean, that's not exactly a statement that you hear every day. They made a covenant with death. If I were to say, who wants to make a covenant with death? I don't think there would be a large line of people saying, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's go make a covenant with death. Because, generally people want to try to stay away from death, not make a covenant with it. What do you mean by a covenant? It means they decided to make an agreement or an alliance with death. Now, why would you make an alliance? Well, if we're going to go out and invade another country, or another country wants to invade us, and we don't want to be invaded, let's just say we are averse to war. We do not want a war. We're going to make a covenant. We're going to make an agreement. We're going to make a league. We're going to make a treaty. All of those words have the same connotation. We're going to make a treaty with this more powerful nation over here so that we don't get invaded. Thereby, we're going to be insulated from the effect of that nation. Does that make sense? So we're going to make a covenant with death. And immediately you're thinking, I didn't know you could do that. Well, you can't. That's the point. That's kind of the point of the passage. But you can sure believe you can. There was a major prophet, and if I said his name, everybody watching this, at least in Africa, would know his name. He said that he declares that the coronavirus is dead, and that all we're seeing now is the aftermath of that. The following week, of course, he canceled his church service, because though he tried to make a covenant with death, and that is exactly what that means. Though he tried to make a covenant with death, the reality of the world that he lives in hit him square in the face. I mean, if the coronavirus is dead, why cancel services? Why don't you just bring those 27,000 people all together, pack them real tight in a building, and let them all breathe on each other, right? Because the coronavirus is dead. See, the covenant with death was made, but it couldn't stand because, you ready for this? It wasn't true. And so, with the goal of this is that death would have no power over them. They're going to make a covenant with death, so death doesn't have a power over them. Hell here is a word for the grave, the physical grave, or for the world of the dead. It's another way of saying death. It is a complementary statement to the statement of a covenant with death. Okay? So let's read what the Bible says. It says, "Because you've said we've made a covenant with death," verse 15, "and with hell are we at agreement." Okay? So this is the language, meaning that the covenant with death and the agreement with hell is a reinforcing statement, saying the same thing. Both statements are a defiance. Watch this. They're a defiance of the judgment to come. They're saying, and how do you know that? Well, you just read the passage. It's just right there. "When the overflowing scourge shall pass through," not going to come to us. And I remember I had a person on Facebook, and I'll share this conversation with you because it is exactly what we're talking about here. This person said that COVID-19 does not have any power over a Christian. And I said, why? Well, because it's a plague from God. And I said, okay, so it's a plague from God. So does that mean, he says, just like the plagues in Egypt, just like the plagues for the Jewish people when they were in Egypt, if they had the blood on the door, the death angel passed over them. So Christians are immune from COVID-19. Now you'd think that would be like somebody in Africa, but it was an independent fundamental Baptist in the United States of America. So I asked him, does that mean that a Christian cannot get COVID-19? And he says, as long as a Christian is living in the will of God and following God, they cannot get sick. I said, so every Christian that gets sick, that's proof that they were living in sin. And all of a sudden, it becomes really hard to answer these questions. Because There's been preachers that have died already. There have been pastors that have gotten sick. And immediately, all of a sudden, what are they doing? In essence, what this man is doing, this is what he's doing, is he's making a covenant with death. He's doing exactly what this passage is speaking of. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, not going to come to us. No, sir. Not going to come. Guarantee it. We just will have church. There's a church service. A pastor in the United States was just arrested for having a church service. Why? Because he believes that the overflowing scourge, when it comes, won't come to them. If he believed that people in his church would get sick and die, he would love the people in this church, and he wouldn't bring them all together and spread that sickness around. So they're making a covenant with death. And this is the same thing that Israel did. Here's what Israel said. When the judgment of God comes, it's not going to affect us. It doesn't matter. In other words, what is the statement? And this is very important. It's a statement of righteousness. It's a statement that we're righteous, therefore the judgment of God can't fall on us. There's a problem, though. There's none righteous. No, not one. I mean, if COVID-19 is sent from God, and I'm not saying that it is, I'm just saying that if it is, every person that it kills justly. Every life that's ended, it's ended justly, because the wages of sin is still death. And there are none righteous. But when a man is filled with pride, when a man is filled with scorn, a scornful man, that could be a braggadocious man, it could be an arrogant man, but both of those things are evidences of pride. That prideful man is going to make statements that don't make sense in the world that we live in. Okay, let me find my place in my notes there. Went off on a little bit of a tangent. Okay. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come to us. They were in essence, and this is what I said just a moment ago, they were saying the judgment of God's not going to come on us. We'll be fine. Death can't hurt us. We have a compact. We have a confederacy. We have a covenant. Here's the key statement. It shall not come upon us. Why? For we have made, ready for this? Let me just look at the Bible. Why? Look at verse 15. It shall not come upon us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. That's what the Bible says. And, I've had a number of these conversations with people about this exact topic. And when you get right down to it, and you bring, let me just say this. A lot of people hold a view that's not thought through to the end. They haven't followed that view all the way to the end. Okay? There's a biological process. That virus sits right there on that plastic, and if I touch that and I go like this, I'm going to get sick. It's a biological process. Now, can God interrupt that process? Absolutely. Can God strengthen your immune system? Absolutely. Can God heal a person? Absolutely. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Is God obligated to? No, he's not. To whomsoever he gives mercy, they give mercy. To whomsoever he doesn't, he doesn't. And if God does not give mercy, if a man or a woman dies from COVID-19, it's not a sign that they weren't right with God. Okay, this is the question of Job, right? We could go back and look at Job. What did Job's friends say? Job, you must be a sinner. You've obviously got something terribly wrong with you. Job, if you were right with God, then you wouldn't be sick. And here we have Christians saying the same thing today. They're like the friends of Job, right? Here's the problem. You have to be careful, because what we believe has consequences, and what we believe changes how we interact with people and how people react. And I'll never forget this. There was years ago, before I got into a good fundamental Baptist church, I was in a Pentecostal church. And I remember in that Pentecostal church, there was this woman, and she had cancer. This woman loved God. She was the sweetest, godliest woman. I'm sure she's a sinner, right? But she's like a grandmother. And, we all know grandmothers are, at least appear to us, or we believe they're sinless. But in all seriousness, she was just a good woman. And she came to church, and the preacher kept telling her, if you were right with God, God would heal your cancer. And what could have been a time in her life where she could have lived in and walked in the grace of God and had grace as she walked through the valley in the shadow of death, she was vexed with this idea that there's somewhere in her there was something wrong. And she went to her grave wondering if she was even right with God, if she was even saved. She had no assurance of salvation, because if she was taught a theology that if she was right with God, then why would this cancer be there? And let me give you the answer to that. Are you ready? You know why that cancer was there? Because the wages of sin is death. Not the sin that she may be in right now as she's dying, but the fact of the matter is that every one of us has sinned throughout our life, and that every one of us are going to die unless the rapture happens. Look at the statement. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hid ourselves. These are the lies that people try to make a refuge. Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. This happened in the Old Testament, and it's happening today. If you want to do something really interesting, go on the internet and look up news reports and articles from the 1918 to 1919 pandemic. Churches were closed, schools were closed, the government, church groups were arrested, people were arrested, the government was, the people that were arrested sued the government for infringement of rights. The Supreme Court, not even the Supreme Court, lower courts consistently upheld that the government had the right to do this in a pandemic. And all this played out in 1918. Over 100 years ago. This is not a new rodeo for the United States. It's just none of us were alive then. We don't remember it. But you could literally take news articles from newspapers in 1918, post them on Facebook as contemporary, and everyone would believe that that's what was going on right now, that article was written yesterday. It's that profound. So one of the things that you find comfort in, or I do, is there's nothing new under the sun. This isn't some new thing that the world has never seen. And the reactions to it are not new either. These statements in the Bible that we're reading about these men that made a covenant with death, these statements that we're reading about men that said, we're in agreement with hell, that happened in the Old Testament. And friends, that's happening today. It's the same thing that's going on today that happened then. If I said something like COVID-19 could come and totally shut down the entire world economy just 3 months ago, you know what people would say in the West? You're crazy. In fact, as it was shutting the world economy down, people are still saying, you're crazy. There's people out now that think it's a giant conspiracy. Totally unaware that New York City has a refrigerator semi-trucks being parked at hospitals to receive the bodies because the morgues are full. And that's a very sad thing. But it's the same. The idea is that in the West, we deal with it differently. We deny it. We say there's no way that this could happen. And I think all of us have this experience that we pull up the news reports and we see what's going on. And we look at each other and we say, is this even real? Why? Because we've come to a point in the West where we believe that technology and medical care and technology and smart scientists, they can fix anything. It's like I had a conversation with one person, and I was posting something about this, and he's like, no, it's no big deal. They'll have a vaccine in 2 weeks. Just like that. Now, why would he make a statement like that? Totally ignorant statement. I mean, it's not going to happen in 2 weeks. It physically can't. That process will take 10 months, maybe even 18 months from now, assuming that they can develop a vaccine for it. Why? Because they've made a covenant with death. Death can't hurt us. We have scientists. Death can't hurt us. We have medicine, right? And that's the same sort of a thing. The Tanzanian president came out and he said that COVID-19 is of the devil. Now, I'm not exactly sure how he knows this. Because, maybe everything, people look at things and they say this, they say, if it appears bad to me, it's obviously of the devil. I mean, he could say the same thing in the times of Jerusalem. This is why these statements are dangerous. Look at this overflowing scourge. Imagine if you're in Jerusalem. Look, the overflowing scourge is coming. Here come the armies that are coming. They can say, well, that's of the devil. It's so easy to say that, wouldn't it? But it wasn't. It was of God, right? So that being said, he said COVID-19 is of the devil, and the devil can't work in church. So you can't get COVID-19 in church. Now, I'm not sure what kind of churches he's going to, but I've gone to a lot of churches, and I've seen the devil well at work in church. I've seen the devil working overnight in church. In fact, probably in church, the devil's probably the most faithful attender of church. Because he's there to disrupt it. He's there to discourage people. He's there to cause problems. And friends, the idea that you can't get COVID-19 in church is just not true. That's flawed logic. So what's going to happen? In Tanzania, the people are going to come to church. They're going to believe this, and it's going to spread like wildfire. Because you can't make a covenant with death, right? You can't just declare something, say it's true, believe it, and then just ignore the reality of something around you. Now, I'm making an application of what they did in Jerusalem to what's going on right now. And I'm using this passage as an illustration of that. But the parallels, I think you would agree, are profound in this passage with what's going on today. You know, the devil worked in the Garden of Eden. And that was a perfect environment created by God where man and woman had not sinned. And who was there at work? Satan. So, to say this just doesn't even make sense. To say that the devil can't work in church, well, how in the world did he work in the Garden of Eden then? How is that even possible? He's just making a covenant with death. He's just saying the same thing the people in Jerusalem said. We're good people. We're Christian people. We love God. Therefore, the overflowing scourge shall not come. Not wise. In general, people think they're invincible. In general. Especially young people. Young people don't. Yeah, Joe's down there like, what? They think they're invincible. That nothing they can do is ever going to cause death to come. Our culture, especially in the West, ironically, is obsessed with death. You look at all the music about death. You look at the pop culture about death. You look at it's just death is that people are almost drawn to it. But then, when they're faced with real death, they're shocked. And it's kind of a contrast, isn't it? They're obsessed with the idea of death, abortion, the music. There's just so many examples. They're obsessed with the idea. But then when actual death comes, and it comes en masse, they're totally shocked by it. And that's, what does that show you? It shows you that the obsession with death and the reality of death, they're living in a world that's not congruent, so to speak. The idea of being obsessed with death and then being shocked by the reality of death shows that this idea is held in a world that's not really understood. Does that make sense? And then you come back in Africa, people see death often. But then what they do is they claim power over death. False prophets declare COVID virus is dead. They're making a covenant with death and with hell. We're not going to die. We're going to be saved. I'll just declare. I see it on Facebook. Some of my Facebook friends that are Africans, I see it there. I declare COVID-19 to be wiped away from Africa. Well, you may not have the power to do that, friend. You're not God. And acting like God by declaring your sovereign power over the created world is not going to change the world. You're not God. Only God has the power to do that. If you want to do something, you beg that God will remove it. You don't go out there and declare that you're going to remove it by your power. Acting like God, that's one of those lies that they're making refuge. They, like the false prophets, like the people we read about here, are filled with pride. And they hide, here's where they hide, in falsehood. And now God gives the answer in verse 16. This is the answer to death. Okay? It doesn't matter if the Assyrians or the Babylonians are coming to take over Israel or Judah. It doesn't matter if that's the problem with death. It doesn't matter if it's a pandemic. It doesn't matter if it's old age. It doesn't matter if it's cancer or It doesn't matter if it's heart disease. It doesn't matter if it's a stroke. It doesn't matter if it's a train wreck or a car crash. It doesn't matter. Death is death. The cause of the death is of little concern. Whether or not it's a judgment of God or whether it's the natural progression of life is of little concern. The answer to death in all situations of death is given by God in verse 16. He says this in verse 15. They've made lies our refuge. This is what the people have done. This is what man does. They make lies their refuge, and under falsehood they hid themselves. They're gonna deal with death by making lies their refuge, and they're going to deal with the problem of death by hiding themselves in falsehood. How many times do you see that? How many times do we see that? It's just common. It's common, common, common. Therefore, because of this, now look at the mercy of God here. Look at the mercy of God. Because man has turned away from God, because man has made a covenant with death, because man has denied that death will come, because man believes he's going to live forever and death's not going to affect him, because they've made lies their refuge, that when I die, I'm just nothing and there's nothing there, there's no hell. That's a lie that people take refuge in. And they believe that. It's not true, but they believe it. They're taking refuge in that to deal with the imminent problem of death, right? Because man has done that, therefore saith the Lord, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation stone, a stone. So God says, I'm going to put this foundation, I'm going to lay in Zion a stone, a foundation stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. It's the foundation stone. It's tried. How was Jesus was tried? He was proven. He was tempted in all points, like as we, yet without sin. He's a precious stone. He died. He took our place. He paid the penalty for our sin. I was talking with a Muslim man just today, and I've never seen a Muslim so open. I've never seen it. He's sitting there, and he realized the problem. I said to him, you know, one of the ways we can take a worldview, and we can look at a worldview and see a problem in a worldview, is that there's a conflict within the worldview with the reality of the world that we see. The atheist, like a Richard Dawkins, who comes out and says that there is no moral right and wrong. We're just molecules in motion. There's no good. There's no bad. We're just a biological machine doing what we've been programmed to do by nature. But then when he says this, he says, well, God's a moral monster. Immediately, the humanity jumps out of Richard Dawkins and he declares that there's a moral right and a moral wrong. It's a truth that he knows, right? It's a truth that he knows. Even though his ideology says there's no right and wrong, in his heart he knows there's a right and wrong. And when he's dropped guard, his guard is dropped, that comes out. Likewise, I said, we know that a judge cannot just let a man go. But if there's a guilty man standing before that judge, and that judge says, you're free to go because you asked for forgiveness, that judge becomes a co-conspirator in the crime of that individual because he did not execute righteous judgment upon that man. I said, we know that. And this man looked at me and said, yes. And I said, we know that. And the physical world's a picture of the spiritual, and the spiritual is a picture of the physical. The rules that we understand in the physical world, we understand them because we're made in the image of God. And that's why we can understand what justice is and judgment is. And he says, you're right. And I said, so when we look at the spiritual things, how in the world can God stand in heaven? And you come to Allah and you say, forgive me, and Allah just says, you're forgiven. How is that just? He said, it's not. And I said, that's why God had to inhabit the creation. Just like he came into the burning bush, and just like he spoke to Moses, he came into the flesh that was Jesus Christ. He was 100% man, and he was 100% God. God inhabited man and spoke to the creation. And then God did something unbelievable. That tried stone, that precious cornerstone, that sure foundation, Jesus came into the world to be the solution to death. For the problem of death is because of the problem of sin. And the wages of sin is death, so Jesus tasted death for every man. When he died, he paid the penalty that you owe and that I owe. It doesn't matter if the Babylonians come and kill you. It doesn't matter if COVID 19 kills you. It doesn't matter if you die of a ripe old age. The wages of sin is death, and the payment will be made. But Jesus Christ, that sure cornerstone, he came and he died that you might have life. He offers a full pardon, and he can offer it because God the Father is satisfied with the sacrifice of God the Son. He saw the travail of his soul in Isaiah 53. He was satisfied. What a wonderful and powerful message that is. Christ comes, and he's the answer. And I want you to notice the contrast here, because the contrast is huge. The prideful, scornful man comes and claims to offer a place of refuge from the judgment of God. They declare that death has no power. They declare and they believe with all their heart that the judgment of God will not fall upon them. They think they're good. And they declare that this scourge shall not come upon us. And you think, do people really believe death won't come upon them? Oh yes. They'll even believe that they can become so good enough that when they die, God's going to let them into heaven. And look at the contrast. Christ comes, and he's the answer. God says, because you've made a covenant with death, because you do not believe. Now think about this. You do not believe that death is going to come. Maybe one believes physical death will one day come, but few believe that spiritual death will come. If you ask people, even in the United States, if you ask people, if you died today, where do you think you'd go? 90% of them will say, I'm going to heaven. They don't say, I don't believe heaven exists, and I believe it's just in the grave, and I believe that I just ceased to exist, like an atheist naturalistic worldview. They think they're going to heaven. Do you know why? They've made a covenant with death, and they've made lies their refuge. You see that? Well, I'm a good person. Really? And you think about the contrast of that. Have you ever lied? Oh yeah. What's that make you? Normal, human, just like everybody else. No, it makes you a liar. Have you ever stolen anything? Well, that was a long time ago. So you cease being a thief because time goes by. You cease needing to be punished for the thievery because time has gone by. The wages of sin is time. It's not what the Bible says. The wages of sin is death. People don't want to believe that they're wicked. I talked to a young man, really wonderful young man. I really enjoyed his company. And he said, he says, I didn't get saved until I was like 19 or 20 years old. I grew up in a missionary's home, grew up in a preacher's home. I said, what kept you from getting saved? He said, well, I knew I was a sinner, but I just didn't believe I was wicked. He thought he could be good enough. He thought he was okay. He didn't realize he was wicked. And so that's the lies that people make their refuge. And it manifests in many different ways, and we've talked about those. But because of that, because man makes lies their refuge and falsehood, they hide themselves, God sends his Son to deliver a message and to make a payment. Denying death does not lead someone to Christ. Denying that, what do I mean by that? I mean, saying that we're good, we're going to go to heaven, saying that you can be good enough, saying that works will get you to heaven, saying that, we're not that bad. Denying the reality of the second death does not, either through being good as a Christianese worldview or denying it as far as an atheistic worldview, neither one of those are going to lead a man to Christ. Death has to be boldly proclaimed. And the reality of death and the penalty of death and the cause of death being sin has to be boldly proclaimed. It's the realization that the judgment of God, and that judgment is real, that leads men to flee the judgment to come and to cleave unto the cross. Notice, men in this passage seek to, watch. The men in this passage, these scornful leaders of Jerusalem, they seek to remove the need for Jesus Christ by denying the impending reality of death. You see that? It's not going to come on us. God's judgment's not going to fall on us. We're good. We're going to go to heaven. As long as you're good, as long as you treat people right, you'll be fine. Not true. I remember when my little nephew passed away, and he was like 18 months old, and I sat there and I watched a Lutheran priest say, we know he's going to heaven because I baptized him. Well, aren't you the Savior then? Listen, baptism never got anybody to heaven. Baptizing an 18-month-old child doesn't send a 12-month-old or a 2-month-old child. That doesn't get that child in heaven. We believe that child is safe because David said that he's going to come to that child. That child was in heaven. That was his implication. But those things, those works don't save anybody. They're making lies their refuge. God is going to judge the world. He says this, judgment also will I lay at the line. Hand me that plumb bob right down there. We should have had this ready. So it was a seamless transition. We're not really up on this internet stuff. But this is cool. Why is it cool? Because it's a tool. And tools are cool. This, I don't have a string onto it, so you'll just have to bear with me. This is a plumb bob. This is a big, heavy piece of brass. In fact, here is the string. And what you do with this is this: you take this string and you put this string around this plumb bob. It's got a little hole on it, and you hang this plumb bob. I should have put that hole through there first. But you hang this, and what does it do? When you hang this in a string, this is a good illustration gone bad because we weren't prepared. You hold this string line, and the plumb bob pulls the string line straight. Boy, this is a nice plumb bob. And what that can do is it produces an absolute straight up and down line. Why? Because the law of gravity makes it straight. God's law makes this line straight. Now, you can walk into a house, and if the wall on that house is a little bit off, you take this plumb bob and you hang this plumb bob. And there's a big one, it's got a small one, it's got pencils in here, it's got all kinds of stuff. Wonderful tool. You can hang that onto a wall, and you can scribe an absolute straight line. It doesn't matter if every wall, and I'm just looking around this house right now. Well, I tell you what, if you come to Africa, you're going to see some walls that this was not used on. Amen? We got one wall at our church that goes like this, and the other wall on the other side goes like this. And I'm telling you what, they're 12 inches off. And so it's a good tool. Now, what's funny is if it's just a little bit off, it doesn't look off until you hang the plumb bob, right? Once this plumb bob is hung, it tells everything. It's just like a level. I mean, the same principle as a level. You put a level across the wall, and you can tell. Well, I tell you, I took my level out where these guys were laying these blocks, and I'd stick that level on the wall, like I knew what I was doing, right? And maybe I do, maybe I don't, maybe I probably don't know. I'm not a block layer, but they knew that I was putting a level on the wall. So you know what they did? Well, all their walls were level because they knew. I'm like, hey, there's a little spot here, it's not quite level. Oh, okay, we'll get that fixed. They knew I was watching. And you know what? God's watching. And he's got his plummet. Okay? He's got his plummet. That's what the Bible's term is. That word plummet means a plumb bob. The bottom of this is sharp like a knife. So it'll make an absolute, just sharp point right into the cement or into the wood below. And you can say, okay, from that point to the point up in the ceiling, we can draw a straight line. And what does God say? He says, therefore, saith the Lord, I'm going to lay this foundation stone, a tried stone. And he says in verse 17, judgment also will I lay to the line. Okay, what's that line? That's that line on that plummet, and righteousness to the plummet. We're going to check your righteousness out. That's what God's saying. He's going to say, here's the wall you built with your life. Here it is. You ready? You tried to build it straight. I know. You tried to lay the blocks exact. I know. You didn't try to lay nobody tries to lay a wall like this. Nobody maybe. Most people don't try to lay the wall like this, right? They don't, but it just happens because they don't have the skill to lay the wall straight, right? So a man comes, he tries to be a good life, he tries to live, he tries to follow the law, tries to keep the commandment, and God says, I'm going to take the plummet and I'm going to lay a line down and I'm going to take your righteousness and I'm going to lay it to the line. It means he's going to test it. He's going to judge whether or not your life's been good enough. He's going to lay it to the line and righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies. What's the refuge of lies? The refuge of lies is that you're good enough to go to heaven. The refuge of lies is that you don't need a Savior. The refuge of lies is that you've lived a good life, that you'll be good enough, that God will let you into heaven. He's going to lay it to the plummet. He's going to lay your righteousness to the line. And when he does that, you're going to be found out that that wall wasn't perfectly straight. Now, everybody knows this. This isn't a new revelation. Have you ever felt guilty? You ever felt guilty? That's the conscience, the law of God written on your hearts, telling you that your wall's not level, right? Your wall's not level. You've sinned. You've broken God's law. What does that tell you? The judgment is coming. Death is coming. And you better seek refuge in the sure cornerstone, the precious stone, the sure foundation. Jesus' life was without sin. You better seek refuge in that life. You better get that life given to you as a gift. He's going to remove the refuge of lies, the lie that man can prophetically utter death to go away. Man doesn't have that power. The lie that money can protect the first world nation. He's just going to sweep that away. We're seeing this right now. This COVID-19 is sweeping away a whole lot of lies. Isn't it? Yeah, we'll be fine. We got a strong economy. Really? How's that working out for you? And look at this. It says, the hail, verse 17, halfway through, the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. You know, you may have the best hiding place in the week when you were a kid. Well, you got this really good spot. You think, man, nobody. I remember one time I was playing hide and seek. We just played run from Kara. That was my cousin, and my other cousin Lance. When we were little kids, Lance and I, we'd run from the little sister. Right, universal game of all children. And we're like, and I told Lance, I said, man, this one time, I said, you know what we ought to do? Because Grandpa had this big junkyard, just full of junk. It was a sea of hiding places. I said, we ought to come out here and dig a hole, right? And if we dug a hole and put a pallet on the top of it, she'd never find us. And it worked. We went out, sat in our hole, pulled the pallet over. 30 minutes later, she finally gave up. Not exactly as much fun as failing at the hiding place, right? And it's kind of like, hey, let's go play again. So we go play again. We hop in our hole, pull the pallet over. After a while, she's like, I ain't playing that game. It's hopeless. I'm never going to find you. A lot of people think they've got a hiding place like that where they can hide from the judgment of God. But you know, the one problem with a hole you hide in is if it fills up with water. You can't really stay in the hole if it's filled up with water because you can't breathe underwater. Right? And God says, I'm going to take the waters and they're going to overflow the hiding place. Even the best hiding place is going to be made void by the judgment of the waters of God. And your covenant with death will be disannulled. That's what he says. And your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then shall you be trodden down by it. And you know what? I'm not saying that COVID-19 is that overwhelming scourge, but I am saying that the death that is inherent in life is the overwhelming scourge. Again, whether that death comes from COVID-19, whether it comes from a crash on a minibus, whether it comes from somebody dying of tuberculosis or heart disease or diabetes or old age, that overwhelming scourge is going to come, and it's going to take everybody. And that's why you need a Savior. The passage goes on to lay out the judgment of God upon the nation of Israel, who could no longer hear God due to their pride and scornfulness. And if you look in the book of Corinthians, 1st or 2nd Corinthians. I'm not going to go there today just because of time. We're about 48 minutes. I want to wrap this up. I had an idea that this would be done in 30 minutes, but obviously that's not the case. Paul says that the sign of tongues, that the speaking of tongues, that tongues is a gift, is a sign not for them that believe, but for them that believe not. And the reference that he gives in that passage refers back to Isaiah 28. The big contrast, and that's just there's a whole other message there. On this passage is the passage that Paul points to, because the tongues are always associated with the judgment of God, and they're always associated with the people that will not hear God. That's just a side note. I want you to notice the big contrast. One claims death cannot hurt, it will not come. These false prophets, these scornful leaders of Israel that say we're good, God's not going to give us death, we're not going to die from this, the judgment of God can't hurt us, and one promises to come, that's Jesus Christ, and take the horrible price of death, and in its place give life. I believe everybody here on our end of the world, on this side of the camera, is saved, but maybe not. I don't know if you're born again or not. But if there was ever a time when you really needed to think about death, it's right now. I mean, in the third world country, there's no medical care. You get this, your life is totally in the hands of God. And you've got to know for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that number one, that death can come. And if it doesn't come today, praise the Lord, but it'll come tomorrow. You got to believe that. Don't make lies your refuge. Believe the truth, that the wages of sin is death, and it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. And let me ask you out there, do you know for sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you're going to go to heaven when you die? If you answer anything other than, I realize I deserve to go to hell, I'm a sinner, and I have trusted in Jesus Christ, you're not going to make it. It's the only right answer. And Jesus Christ, he's that sure rock and that sure cornerstone. And he has come to take the penalty of death and give you life. Whether that judgment is this one or that one, whether it comes today or tomorrow, he gives life that's everlasting, and he gives life that's eternal. And we thank God for that. We'll go ahead and end now. If you need to be saved, you can pray right where you are and call on Christ, and he will save you. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa or in America, he'll save you.